Thank you. Thanks, Adam, for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for coming. I guess giving a paper like anything, a new defense, is giving a bit of a hostage to fortune in case someone else has made the argument back in 1988 or something like that. But in this paper, I propose a sort of a triplet of arguments to defend the liberal curriculum. I'll tell you guys what that means in a little while. So I'm hoping that at least the combination of the three different arguments makes it into a new argument. Let's hope that's in fact the case. Thank you. I'm only going to use the PowerPoint when it actually adds something. I'm not by any means flashing up everything that I say. Alongside institutions like science, the media, libraries, museums, and so on, the education system, I would say, fulfills a largely epistemic purpose in society. The institutions that comprise the education system, like schools, universities, and colleges, are there to provide children and young people with the knowledge and skills they're going to need to play their role as adults in society. And the reason I think that epistemologists should take education more seriously is the profound impact that our educational institutions have, mostly for the good, but very often for ill, on what people actually do and do not know. Besides influencing what people know, these institutions also shape the character of people's thinking, like Ian was talking about before lunch. So really, if we're realistic about it, the education system contributes like few other social systems do to shape the actual state of knowledge and of thinking in society. Disagree with me if you like in the question. So in this paper, I want to provide a systematic account of issues in education that should be of interest to analytic epistemologists in particular, and I want to focus on one thing that is perhaps of more importance than anything else when we think about education to parents and to teachers and to policymakers, and that's it's also a pretty controversial question, really. That is the question of what the school curriculum should look like. I consider a classical defense of the idea that the school curriculum should be a liberal curriculum. And what I mean by liberal curriculum is the idea that children should receive a broad and mainly theoretical education in the modern school disciplines. I will say a little bit later on in the paper what exactly the modern disciplines are, but you won't go far wrong by knowing that there's something like mathematics, biology, chemistry, history, geography, literature, and so on. Now, the philosophy of education, the part of the subject that I study, hasn't tended to look kindly on traditional justifications for the liberal curriculum at all. I'm going to tell you what sort of criticisms people have of the liberal curriculum, and then I'm going to offer a new defense of liberal education. Now, some of the most important concepts in education are completely epistemic concepts. Among them are the concepts learning, teaching, and education itself. So in what sense do I say that learning, teaching, and education are epistemic concepts? Well, a lot of people point out, in fact, I'd say the majority of philosophers of education point out that in addition to learning and teaching and educating for knowledge, for things that students are supposed to come to know, a lot of educational effort is also directed at learning, teaching, and educating for moral or political values, for aesthetic preparation, for vocational preparation, preparing people for work, and so on. I think the dominant current of thinking in our field is that education's role is not really the transmission of knowledge about the world, but values, attitudes, skills, sensibilities, and so on. So this is, well, I can understand where people are coming from, but what they don't see is that the fields of morality, of politics, of aesthetics, of economics and work and so on, all have their particular epistemology as well. What it is to learn about any of these fields, what it is to learn about morality, or to learn about politics, or to learn about work, or something like that, or what it is to be taught in any of these fields, or what it is to receive an education in them, this may differ from field to field, but it's hard to deny that teaching and learning in these broad areas will amount to something like fostering and acquiring a facility in these areas that we're going to give some kind of a name, like knowledge or understanding or know-how or skill or even wisdom. Simply put, to think about what teaching, learning, and education ultimately are is to involve oneself in doing epistemology. So that's why I want to see the field of the philosophy of education as a sort of a subfield of epistemology, rather than wanting to see it as a subfield of ethics or political philosophy. So in this sense, I think that what we're doing is really epistemology and thinking about education. Now, next to analyzing concepts, a further important debate in the philosophy of education is over what the proper aim of education is. Should education promote knowledge? Should it promote understanding? Should it promote rational thinking, wisdom even, or perhaps a range of these different goods? To give you a sense of the debate, I quickly review some work on this by Alvin Goldman and Harvey Siegel and propose a sort of a compromise that I find in Adler's work. In his Knowledge in a Social World, Goldman considers what our goals are in our cognitive lives as such. Goldman holds that our overriding cognitive goal is to maximize the amount of true knowledge that's at our disposal. Goldman holds that the task of social epistemology is to evaluate individual knowledge, but also to evaluate the social processes in terms of how well or badly they contribute to boosting a person's stock of knowledge. Goldman notices that most epistemology is focused on the individual's approach of finding out knowledge for oneself, but by contrast, he thinks that the question of how we gain true information from other people needs to be explored in more depth. And then Goldman asks what forms of social organization there are that promote the stock of knowledge. He investigates science, law, democracy, and education. Now, about education, Goldman says the following. The fundamental aim of education, like that of science, is the promotion of knowledge. But science seeks new knowledge, knowledge that is new for mankind. But education seeks knowledge that is new for individual learners. So it might be old knowledge, but it's new to the person learning it. Now, Harvey Siegel here has made the following criticism of Goldman's position about this. Goldman thinks what is important to boost is the stock of true beliefs that a person holds, and to shrink the stock of false things that they believe. But Siegel points out that mere true belief held without rational justification can't be the aim of education. If it were, that would imply that educational methods such as brainwashing or indoctrination would be acceptable. As long as a student ends up believing the truth, on Goldman's view, it doesn't much matter how they end up believing the truth. Imagine, for instance, that we get our students to believe a large number of truths by giving them a pill, or by putting them in a brainwashing machine or something like that. Goldman would have to applaud this kind of method, but we wouldn't say, educationally speaking, that this is acceptable or even laudable. We wouldn't say that's education going on there if we brainwashed people with some kind of machine. So Goldman, I think we can say, holds that the aim of education is fostering true belief, and Siegel holds that it is fostering rational thinking or justification. So this naturally invites the response, well, the aim of education should be fostering knowledge. That is true belief that is also justified. And of course, Harvey and Goldman fight this out between them. But Jonathan Adler puts it this extremely nicely. Adler holds that we should understand the knowledge aim of education in terms of the acquisition of justified true belief. So people should, through education, come to believe true things that are also justified. But Adler also stresses the necessity to add some kind of condition that deals with Gettier cases. Adler thinks that once we understand the relationship between some kind of a JTB plus account of knowledge and education clearly enough, then this will actually be able to give us normative educational guidance. So Adler thinks if we do enough epistemology, enough JTB plus kind of epistemology, then we'll understand properly what knowledge is. Because education aims at knowledge, then this will also begin to generate for us some kind of prescriptions about how we conduct the educational process. So Adler's thinking works like this. If the aim of education is knowledge, then education must aim at true belief and justified belief. And to rule out Gettier cases, We must also make sure that the justification that children say here for believing certain things establish for them that the beliefs that their teachers say transmit to them are true. So from this it follows that if the point of education is to turn students into knowers, part of the task of the educator is to make it salient for students how the justification for what they are taught establishes the truth of what they believe. So I think Adler's formulation is really elegant. He thinks education is there to make sure that students are real knowers after having gone through an educational process, not knowers that can sort of be Gettyized or something like that. And this is kind of compelling, I think. In another paper, I've tried to argue that we can give this a kind of a virtue interpretation if we wanted to as well, and say that the point of educating someone is not just to get them to have true beliefs or to think rationally, but it is to enable them properly to know, and that is to be in a position to receive epistemic credit for the kind of things that they say or do or discover or something like that. But in any case, Adler's way of thinking explains one of our most basic educational insights, that rather than merely getting children to believe truths, a good education consists in students beginning to see the connection between the evidence and the truth for themselves. Adler thinks that if we take this tack, then a number of sort of epistemic consequences already flows from that. I'll flash up two for you. The one thing that Adler thinks follows from this is that if the point of education is to bring children to see that the evidence with which they're presented establishes something as true, then this rules out indoctrination or brainwashing as education. And that's a good sort of a consequence to fall out of this. And Adler also thinks that this should let us adopt some kind of an evidentialist strategy in how we decide what to teach. We should teach those things that are backed up by the evidence. And Adler holds that these 2 points provide support for a traditional liberal education comprising the familiar school subjects like mathematics, science, history, literature, and so on. On Adler's view, the liberal curriculum is nothing but a collection of, I quote, significant truths plus those truths requisite for comprehension of the significant ones. For Adler, the fact that we have evidence for the truths of various scientific claims made in the liberal curriculum, and that they sort of the evidence sort of mounts on top of other evidence in a kind of a structure, give us an idea of what we should put in the curriculum. Now, it's really important to notice that in his justification of a liberal education in traditional subjects, Adler starts from the current curriculum and asks how epistemological considerations like the JTB Plus account of knowledge helps explain or justify why we have this curriculum that we actually do have. However, starting with the current curriculum and asking how it makes sense in terms of epistemological considerations is to assume that the current or standard liberal arts curriculum gets the specifics of what children should learn more or less right. And that what we need to provide is a justification that grounds this curriculum in terms of epistemological thinking. So Adler, while Adler sort of pays lip service to the idea that we should figure out which are the significant truths and what else do we need to know to begin to see that the significant truths are justified by the evidence, while he says that this is how we should go about designing a curriculum, Adler himself doesn't actually end up doing that. He ends up saying something different. He says, well, if we look at the current curriculum that we have, then it makes sense in terms of our epistemological thinking. Adler doesn't do that reconstructive task of building a curriculum from the ground up. He just says, look, we've got this curriculum, and it must be that. The reason why we have this one and the reason why it is justified, we can explain in terms of epistemology. And I think the problem with this is that this kind of move just rationalizes the curriculum that we already have in terms of the state of epistemology. Or we could say what it does, it matches epistemological justification with the state of how our curriculum actually looks. But whether the traditional curriculum of studying subjects does get the curricular choices right is a matter of very, very big debate. In fact, in sort of progressive educational thinking, I would say I'm in a minority in still thinking that the liberal curriculum is a justified one. A lot of educational theorists would much rather that we move away from it. So the question we need to answer in rational curriculum planning is not how can we justify or explain the fact that we teach what we teach. This is how Adler thinks about it. But why should we teach this rather than that in the first instance? Adler doesn't, in the end, provide an argument for or against teaching any specific subjects at all. Now, trying to make some kind of an argument, some philosophical argument about why or what subjects to teach and why we should teach them is a sort of an old project in the philosophy of education. And Hursts and Peters spent the 1960s and 70s trying to do this. Hursts and Peters are still, I think, the strongest advocate of what I call liberal education. For Hurst, a liberal education is a general theoretical education, taking in the liberal school subjects like science, mathematics, literature, language, history, and geography. And Hurst and Peters sought to justify the superiority of this curriculum in terms of how it follows from the very definition of knowledge. So in that sense, Hurst and Peters tried to do exactly the same thing as Adler. They start off doing epistemology and then try to derive prescriptions for what teachers should teach in classrooms from that. As Hurst puts it, liberal education is the appropriate label for an education based fairly and squarely on the nature of knowledge itself. Now, how do Peters and Hurst justify the superiority of the liberal curriculum on these purely philosophical grounds? Peters' first and best known answer to this question is a transcendental argument. He holds that even asking the question of what should go on the curriculum presupposes an answer in terms of knowledge. He writes, insofar as someone can stand back from his life and ask the question, why this rather than that, he must already have a serious concern for truth built into his consciousness. I'll explain Peters' thinking a tiny little bit. Peters thinks that anyone who asks this question, what should I learn, is already committed to find out a whole bunch of things. They're committed to finding out what there is to learn. If I ask the question, what should I learn, it presupposes that I know what my options are. Also that they find out something about what there is to learn about what there is to learn. It is no good saying the options on the table, the options on the learning menu are mathematics, science, biology, history. You also need to know a little bit about what mathematics, science, biology, history, and so on are. And Peters thinks that it already commits you, asking, what should I learn, already commits you to asking questions like, well, what is more important, woodworking or the fundamentals of physics, something like that. This is what Peters thinks about this. If he's right, then even asking this curriculum question, what should our children learn, commits us to something like thinking, well, at the end of the day, children are going to have to learn, study a broad curriculum that takes in sort of human knowledge in the round. Now, there are significant problems with Peters' view. What if the individual learner herself never asks the question, what should I learn? And I think most people in the world are in something like that position. Very few people actually step back, at least at school age, and ask themselves, what should I be learning? The fact that Richard Peters asks himself that question, and the fact that perhaps the question commits him to asking further questions like those, still don't give us a justification that we can present to individual learners about why they should be committed to finding out all of these things. The transcendental question sort of goes to work when we, I suppose, when we do philosophy. But does that translate into a justification that I can present to a reluctant child who doesn't want to learn anything about the history of conquest or something like that, why they should be learning it. Just imagine yourself giving a justification to a real child, asking, well, why should I learn about the Spanish conquest of South America? And then giving your justification along the lines of, well, if you ever did ask yourself what you should be learning, then you'll discover that this commits you to asking a whole lot of things about human experience in the broad. And the Spanish conquest, it's a bit unrealistic. Furthermore, Peters' argument commits one to imagining that school or university needs to equip one with a vast knowledge of human affairs. It's only if we knew about human experience in the round in great depth that we could even begin to ask these questions. So Peters' justification I don't think is going to work, and it sort of fell out of favour towards the middle 70s. Hurst offers a different kind of justification for the liberal curriculum. Hurst notices how many different subjects there are and how different they are from one another. The different subjects that we study all have distinct concepts. They've got distinct logical structure. Different subjects test truth claims in different kinds of ways. They have different techniques. So this should be familiar to anyone who has a sort of an interest in the I suppose the grouping and the sociology of academic disciplines, and I think Hurst is right in this. He follows his thinking through, and he groups the school subjects in 8 forms that he thinks follows from analyzing subjects into, according to their evidential structures and their concepts and so on. And this is the list that he comes up with. He thinks that these are sort of 8 that are really different from one another and that are particularly good to go on a school curriculum. Now we see some weird choices there. Why I think philosophy and morality, for instance, are different. Religion, why give religion a specific place amongst in the list? I suppose that the specifics itself isn't all that important. I think very few of us would disagree with Hurst that different subjects are different. But we would begin to disagree in how he translates that into a real curriculum. And then actually the big question for Hurst is, just noticing that different forms of knowledge are different, Hurst then goes on to say children need to learn about all of them if they are going to understand human thinking in the round. And I just don't see how that follows. Granted, different subjects are different, but why do we need to make children study all of them? And this is a question that Hurst himself never answered. In fact, in later writing, he sort of rode back from this way of thinking. And he started to accept what his critics were saying, that really the subjects just come from entrenched interests. It's social factors that make it the case that certain subjects are compulsory to study at school, not rational considerations. So I don't think either Peters or Hurst's account is going to fly. Now, Hurst's list of disciplines would appear familiar to anyone who underwent a theoretical secondary education from over the last century. Not all country school curricula cover exactly those subjects, but a curriculum comprising mandatory study in a majority of those is common in very many parts of the world. And their critics, Hurst and Peters' critics, said that what they do is often no more than an apology for the kind of curriculum that we already have, and that the liberal curriculum made up of traditional subject disciplines are shaped more by power relations than by purely rational thinking. John White, for instance, points out that Hurst and Peters, much like Adler does, starts from the existing school curriculum and merely rationalizes the superiority of this curriculum in terms of a little bit of epistemology. White instead traces the history of a number of sort of curriculum struggles through the 17th, 18th and 19th century, and he thinks that why we have a liberal curriculum and why we even call it liberal is a function of this history. it's a little bit interesting. So White sketches, well, to my mind, fairly convincingly, that the liberal curriculum is really the sort of middle-class curriculum from the 1800s and the 1900s. It's specifically not the classical curriculum that school children here or the children at the great public schools in England studied in the 1800s. The classical curriculum was the trivium and the quadrivium, grammar and rhetoric and logic at the first level, and then music and astronomy and something else at the second level. So really, why we have a liberal curriculum, why we have modern school subjects studied at school, is founded on the fact that we threw out the classical curriculum. He also thinks that it came about through a struggle between the Methodist churches and the Anglican churches in how they organized their associated schools as curricula, and even Yale and Harvard, where they started adopting a modern subjects, while Oxford and Cambridge were still teaching mostly classical subjects. So White thinks that the reason why teachers and policymakers like to drum up the modern school subjects as the compulsory one is really just traditionalist, and it's really completely biased in favor of the kind of education a person received themselves. If one imbibes a certain curriculum at school, then one thinks naturally that this is the only possibility or the superior possibility for how a curriculum should look. By contrast, White thinks that we should try to imagine the curriculum from the ground up in terms of what the aims of education are. And White holds that we should conduct some philosophical argument first about what the aims of education are, and then we should design a curriculum to bring about those aims. And for White, this is a really, really important point. The aim of education is to enable children to lead flourishing lives. He thinks children go to school so that they can end up living fulfilled and flourishing and happy lives as adults. Starting with this very, very broad aim, White then holds that we can derive further sub-aims. For instance, flourishing as an individual is promoted by living independently, accomplishing something worthwhile, understanding oneself and the world, enjoying physical pleasures, enjoying aesthetic pleasures, and so on. And continuing along with this kind of thinking, White then designs a new curriculum that's designed to promote the flourishing of individual children. Some of the tasks of enabling flourishing is served well by the study of subjects. For instance, if you're going to have a broad understanding of the world, then studying subjects is very helpful. But for the most part, White rejects a subject-based curriculum completely and thinks that we should, in its place, focus on teaching children certain stances in morality, certain understanding about civic processes, certain understanding about the world of work, and so on, that they will need to flourish as persons. In effect, White proposes a kind of a happiness curriculum that's on the policy table very strongly in England at the moment. Now, for Hurst and Peters, the liberality of the liberal curriculum lies in the fact that it promotes free and independent thinking. Hurst in particular thought that it's only if a person can understand and make use of all of the modes of human thinking that they can truly be an independent thinker. And in advocating their aims-based curriculum, White actually starts from a completely different position. White wants to see a school curriculum that promotes freedom, sure, but this is the kind of freedom that helps children to be happy or to flourish as individuals. There's a very big point of difference here. White thinks that the point of education is eudaimonic. It's to promote well-being, whereas Hurst and Peters and I see the point of the curriculum as epistemic, as getting children to know certain things. And the scales in our part of philosophy, the philosophy of education, is wildly tipped over towards the eudaimonic perspective. Harvey and I are two of the only people who stand by the idea that the point of education isn't flourishing, but is knowledge. And I think if I could just sort of observe, I think maybe this is because most people come to the philosophy of education from from ethics or from political philosophy, rather than from epistemology. In any case, this is what I do in some of my other work. Now, I think that the question that was always difficult for Hurst and Peters to answer was why rational thinking, the rational thinking that they think the education system is there to promote. Why does this require students, individual students, who have different interests and abilities to study the whole range of the modern academic subjects? Hurst's answer that only a person with knowledge of all the different subjects could truly take part in full human experience, this is the kind of thing he wrote, is belied by the fact that most people develop in a facility in only a few subjects. And polymaths are very, very few and far between. If we're to save the idea that education is there for the promotion of knowledge, I think we will have to make a different argument than this argument that the individual must acquire an in-depth knowledge of all the subjects in order to be truly intellectually free. And to explain my sort of new argument, I want to go back to Goldman's thinking about social epistemology. Now, here is the shape of the argument sort of begins here. And it kind of begins with a challenge. Compulsory education is a really big imposition on people's lives. In this country, it is compulsory by law that a person should undergo an education for 14 years. This means that 99.9% of children go to school. It is possible to educate one's child at home, to homeschool, but very few parents actually take this up. Either way, the law compels one to send a child to school for 200 days a year, for 14 years, for about 8 hours a day. And I think there is no other part of society where we make an activity compulsory in the same way. Not even military conscription is as radical as this, because conscription only lasts 2 years, right? Where it still exists. But we send kids, they must go to school for 14 years. And most children, while they are there, they actively dislike what they're being told they must learn. Even people in the world out there after school say that much of what children learn in school is pointless. They say this. I don't believe this, but people say this. So why stick with this? Why stick with this really sort of draconian social imposition on people's time? If, as White points out, it's only there because it's tradition. I think it's much better than that. There's much more to be said for it than that it is just a tradition. And as I say, my argument is designed to show that there is a value in making children study these subjects. Now, some people, like Karl Jaspers, points out that the point of studying, he talks mostly about university, but we can sort of generalize his point, is the maintenance of the scientific disciplines. Now, it's true that if we close down all schools and we close down all universities, then I think science would die in about 30 or 40 years. As the old scientists retire and die, and no new recruits supply those disciplines, then the sciences will disappear. Now, I think Jaspers is right about this, factually speaking, but why should we teach, say, 100 students physics to supply maybe 2 or 3 recruits to the world of physics? Isn't that a gigantic waste of time? Isn't that a terrible waste and imposition on the part of the 98 who don't end up becoming physicists? So I don't think this, as sort of an unadulterated argument like this, is going to work to ground the liberal curriculum. But I think we can offer a different one. Over the last 20 years or so, the developments in social epistemology has led to a different way to think about intellectual autonomy, which is what Hurst and Peters thought they were promoting through the liberal curriculum. It's not clear at all that the ideal thinker is one who's completely autonomous. It's not clear that the ideal thinker is one who figures everything out for themselves from first principles. And there are 2 big reasons for this. Developmentally speaking, it's doubtful whether a person can figure out for themselves everything that is worthwhile to know from the ground up. In fact, just learning to speak a language probably requires that one learns things from other people. And there's also no reason to think that a belief that one has formed for oneself is necessarily more epistemically praiseworthy than one that one takes on trust and one gets from other people. Kitcher summarizes this point in the idea that there exists a division of cognitive labor in society, according to which different people direct their epistemic efforts towards different projects, and that this achieves efficiency in spreading the cognitive load around a group of knowers. This is as true as in science as it is in ordinary life. In science, different scientists each routinely set out to discover different things about the world. They ask different research questions and use different methods and techniques to answer these questions. Academic subjects or disciplines and fields emerge because of this basic division of cognitive labor. One reason that I think epistemologists should take the educational processes seriously is that, in point of psychological and sociological fact, it's our education that prepares us to take part in this massive and pervasive cognitive division of labor. I'll sort of summarize my thinking about it for you on the slide there. In education, we learn how to offer and evaluate testimony, claims that people make in different areas. It's true that we learn the rudiments of doing this by just learning to speak from our parents. However, later on, in the more formal setting of school, we learn to offer and receive and evaluate testimony in more involved ways. We also learn what good testimony in different specialist fields amount to. Education is causally a massive influence on how humans go about dividing cognitive labor between them. Take science. Part of the reason scientists specialize in the subjects they do, and part of the reason they pose and answer questions as they do, is that this is how they were taught to do it. Of course, the subjects that schools teach and the methods they teach also filter down from laboratories to schools. It's not just that schools condition people to think in a certain kind of way and then that's how they end up doing science. But it would be completely idealistic to believe that laboratories are not set up as they are, partly because schools already conditioned people to see the world of subjects in a certain kind of way. Not just schools, but universities as well, further reinforce this identification of people with particular fields. Take this example. Some students at university are taught to do mass spectronomy, and others are taught mass spectrometric immunoassays. The two are very, very similar techniques, but being trained in the first method makes one a chemist, and being trained in the second method makes one a biochemist. So it makes one a chemist or really a kind of biologist. What one is trained in and so on already conditions one and shapes one and pushes one in a certain sort of scientific direction. And what holds for the natural scientific fields like these hold equally in the social sciences or the humanities or in academia completely outside of the university. In the building trades, for instance, there's a very large degree of overlap between the work and the skills and the training of joiners and roofers and carpenters. But there are very, very clear distinctions between these people as tradespeople and between the kind of work that they end up doing eventually. So what I mean to say by that is that causally, just the fact that we have a kind of a division of labor that it filters up from school to what people end up doing in adult life, and it also filters the other way around. Part of the reason why the schools are set up like they are is the demands of what people do after school. So the first argument that I want to make is that the liberal curriculum comprising the traditional school subjects helps structure the very cognitive division of labor that we actually have, and it helps maintain it. This is because the studying subjects for the first time introduce children to the system of the division of cognitive labor that we have. We see mathematical problems as different from problems in physics, as different from problems in chemistry, as different from problems in biology and history and so on. It introduces children to the division of cognitive labor that we have. It introduces them to the very idea that we divide cognitive labor at all, and it introduces them to the modes of thinking that exist in those different subjects. The system of cognitive labor that we have isn't immutable. It's not like it can never change, but changing it will have enormous costs. If we, for instance, tomorrow decide, like we could, that dentistry should be a subdivision of the field of medicine rather than its own sort of occupational field. We could decide this if we wanted to, but it will have enormous costs in terms of reorganizing training, because we'd have to send all dentists to medical school first. That's an example. Or if we tomorrow decided that we want to split off computer programming as a particular part of engineering, there's actually a big fight between engineers and computer scientists over whether computer scientists are engineers. We can organize this differently if we wanted to, but this would also have costs. So I would say this is kind of a conservative argument for the curriculum that we do have. It underpins a sort of a structure that we have of organizing cognitive labor in society. Changing it comes with certain advantages, because this system of the division of labor has already been built up, and trying to change it from the grounds up will come with very, very big costs. So that's the first new argument that I want to make about why it is still a good idea to introduce children at the school level to the broad sweep of our division of cognitive labor. So far, I've considered the importance of education to epistemology in the light of how education causally influences and makes possible the cognitive division of labor. I said that this requires that children learn about the very specialisms that scientists and other experts divide themselves into. And it hints at the idea that children will, after being introduced to the broad sweep of subjects that there are to study, they will begin to specialize in a particular field themselves. However, there's another division of labor argument that goes in the direction of balancing out too much specialization against a broad and comprehensive knowledge of disciplines. And the argument is that some comprehensive knowledge across the disciplines is very, very important in public discourse. Sandy Goldberg notes that in testimony, quite generally, the speaker and hearer are not necessarily the only parties to an exchange. There's an audience. Goldberg notes that when there is an audience to a testimonial exchange, the audience also plays an epistemic role. That's the role of monitoring the exchange for credibility. When an audience overhear a testimonial and exchange in which one person misleads another, for instance, the audience can step in and can correct the misleading testimony. Moreover, when there's an audience present, a testifier usually takes more care in expressing her testimony correctly and precisely. The presence of the audience then plays the epistemic role of keeping testifiers' testimony accurate, precise, and relevant. Goldberg calls this the remote monitoring and policing function of the audience in a testimonial exchange. But what he's really saying is that if there is an audience that know their stuff, then they can call BS on when a person misleads another. So this is a task in the cognitive division of labor. In a community of thinkers and speakers, we all sometimes take the task of monitoring testimonial exchanges for accuracy and for relevance and for precision. Goldberg doesn't go on to make the point exactly like this, but it's clear that people can only play this kind of role in monitoring and policing exchanges if they know enough about a wide variety of topics, and if a reasonable knowledge of a wide variety of fields is well distributed through society. So this doesn't mean that we need all to become experts in classical literature and modern history and physics and biology and computer science and so on. It means that it is still a pretty good idea to distribute a reasonable knowledge of these fields so widely through society that speakers can expect that in their audience there might be someone who knows his stuff and can call BS on me if I mislead them. So here is if the first argument was one about specialization, this one is one about breadth. And the second argument that I want to offer also has to do with breadth. I see that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to summarize this as briefly as I can. Specialization, or too much specialization in science, creates its own kind of problem. Sometimes subject specialists begin to talk past one another. You guys will all be familiar with cases in which people are so specialized in their own field that they can't connect up conclusions from that field to other fields or to the world. So there's a specific kind of insight, knowledge, understanding that's really useful in a world in which there are very, very many specialists, and that is the ability to translate findings between disciplines and to translate findings from disciplines to the public understanding of a discipline. And this also requires a fair degree of breadth of understanding across very many fields rather than increasing specialization. So the argument as it goes is students should study the traditional school disciplines, mostly because we already have them, but it's not bizarre to suggest that we should keep studying them because we already have them, because this is a kind of an inheritance of a division of labor that we have, and that specialization in those disciplines should be underpinned by breadth across the piece for the two reasons that I outlined: to translate findings between disciplines and to make remote monitoring and policing possible. Thank you very much.